Well, hey, everybody. I have a very special guest today. Her name is Jen Messing. She and I have been friends for 20 years. Did
20
we
years.
meet in
It
2002?
was 2002.
We
Yeah.
met 20 years ago. Jen is the founder and executive director of Into the Deep, which brings theology of the body to people in a very unique way. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Jen's experience with being a certification student at the Institute. And Jen, do you call yourself a survivor of cancer? What do you?
Still in the middle of it.
Still in the middle of it.
So whatever you want to call that. I don't know. I don't have a word for it.
All right, so we're going to be
I
talking
happen to
about
have
theology
cancer
of the
in my
body
body.
and cancer.
Right, there you go.
Theology of the cancerous body, a
Yeah.
delicate subject, but very real for a lot of people. So,
Heck yeah.
Jen, tell everybody how you and I met.
Let's see. Somebody gave me tapes. Cassette tapes.
Cassette
Mind
tapes.
you.
So you are one of the early adopters.
Naked Without Shame, baby. Yes. So it was very providential.
Naked Without Shame was the
Sorry.
title
Yeah.
of my first tape series back in the late 90s. Do
Which-
you remember how you got it or who
Oh,
introduced?
yeah. Oh, I have the whole story.
Okay,
I can
let's
tell
hear
you
it,
The
let's
whole
hear it.
reality. My friend, who is now a priest, my friend Father James Adams, his sister Margaret gave him the set of tapes. He and I were hanging out. I didn't even know her yet, but he was exploding one night. It's like, Jen, you would love this. You got to hear this. And he was going to pass on to me. I think he was on tape number 6 or something. And he was going to give it to me. And he's like, wait, no, you have to hear the whole thing from the beginning. And so then he wanted to connect me to Margaret, which is how I met Margaret, actually.
right.
And then ultimately I didn't listen to them. That was the fall of 2000, actually. And I did not listen to them until the spring of 2001 when I was driving to North Dakota to go to a friend's wedding. And I finally stuck them in a whole second round on the way home and
gosh.
listened to them back to back and was like, what the heck? This is insane.
Yeah, so what were your initial impressions? I mean, I want to say this first.
Yeah, sure.
That tape series that came out in 1999, I was young and green and maybe
bold.
and bold.
But see, that's what got all of us sucked in. A lot of us talk about this. People that were around at that time, like Devin and I, even last night, we were talking about this because we were like, that's what got us fired up, is that you were bold. So you don't have to apologize. It's all good. God uses good things for good.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
I look back and I think, man, I was a pretty clumsy dancer at the time. I stepped on a lot of people's toes but I've learned how to be a better dancer over the years. But
I didn't notice at the
and
time.
I rejoice that it reached your heart,
Yes.
and not only reached your heart, it set a new direction for your life.
Oh my gosh! I mean, it woke me up. That's the thing. So I've never had an experience of leaving my faith or having like huge, big doubts about what I believe. Blah blah blah. I just didn't have the words to explain all the details of why do we believe this? Why do we believe that? And so when I listened to the tapes, I was like, this is it. This is it. This is how you explain it. And I listened to it over and over and over, trying to digest the reasoning. And part of it is that I have a social work background. So
Right.
I had been struggling with how I wanted to apply that. I wasn't so sure. I wanted to dive headfirst into the secular realm where I wasn't allowed to really talk about my faith. It wouldn't have been part of the code of ethics, etc. Right. So I was very torn about how I wanted to apply it. When I listened to these tapes, I'm thinking, this is it. This is because when people don't know who they are and why they're here and what love is, they know who they are as a person, right? They do a lot of damage to themselves and others. They hurt themselves, they hurt others, and that's what social problems spring from. So I just thought, I don't want to just put a Band-Aid on stuff. This is getting to the heart of social problems right
So
here.
it was your background in social work that gave you a context for understanding the importance of John Paul's teaching.
I think so. I mean, that plus I had always been into my faith. And honestly, I had a couple particular experiences of like my morality class in high school. And like that brought my attention to why do we teach these things? But it's still, I didn't have the fullness of vocabulary until I listened to the set, because I just thought what I actually articulated at some point was that I had been on retreats, for instance, where you're taken to the cross. You're like, okay, we're sinners. We have to remember that, we're redeemed, etc. Right. But it starts with you're fallen and talks about the redemption piece. But I had never heard anybody go back to the beginning and talk about the pieces of the puzzle that remind us of who we are made to be in the image of God and what that means, because you don't realize until you study it that we breeze by Genesis 1 and 2 so quickly.
Yeah.
We don't realize that the building blocks of who we are as persons.
Yeah.
The personhood piece is what kicked into high gear. Plus, I mean, the logic of love and what is love? How do you define love? I had learned, it's a choice, but it took it further to free, total, faithful, fruitful. You know what I mean? All these things that, even though that's not in the TOB text, it's actually love and responsibility, it's actually humane vitae.
Yeah.
It still is a part of the picture that it all started to build into this, oh my gosh, this is how you explain this. This is the core of everything.
I want to press into something you just said. You said, typically when the gospel is presented, we're told we're fallen, we're sinners, and we need a savior.
Yeah.
Which is true.
Yes.
But if we start with you're a sinner, that's not the beginning of the human story. Right? If we don't go back to the beginning, and this is the basis of the entire theology of the body of JP2, Christ's words that point us back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? The conversation Jesus is having with the Pharisees about marriage and divorce. And Moses allowed you to divorce your wives because of your hardness of heart. But from the beginning,
it was
not so.
Right.
So JP2 takes those words of Christ and says, we have to follow where Jesus is pointing us. Mm-hmm. He's pointing us back to the beginning before sin. Mm-hmm. When we start with you're a sinner and you need a savior, we have no context even for understanding what sin is if we don't go back to the original blueprint of what our humanity is.
Exactly.
Because sin, as you know well, is an archer's term that means, the archer pulls back his arrow. He misses the mark. Well, what the heck's the mark?
Right.
If you're told if you're told you're missing the mark, but you don't know what the mark is, you're not really going to know that you're missing the mark. Mm-hmm. So going back to the beginning, we discover the mark.
Yeah.
And it's not something imposed on us from the outside. I've had this experience over and over and over again, and I'm sure you have too, as a teacher of John Paul's vision.
Yeah.
When the light bulbs turn on in people's minds, they're like, he's putting words to the deepest yearnings of my heart. He's giving me a language to explain what I've always known inside, but maybe never had words to express.
Right.
And speaking of seeing the light bulbs come on when you're teaching, do you know where I'm going here?
Yes, I do, actually. You get to tell this story.
So I'm going to tell this part of the story. I come to, what town was it? Do you remember?
We were in New Ulm.
New Ulm, Minnesota, 2002. I got invited to this parish to give a talk. And I see, if I recall correctly, you were to my right over here, sitting in a pew. And like every other word I would say, you just had this beaming, like... You're like, yes. You're like shake it up, and you're in your pew, like dancing. You're like, yeah. And I was like, I got to meet this girl because she is fired up. And afterwards, there was like a little reception or something. Yeah. And I just knew I needed to meet you because you were. I said,
I could actually correct that.
Okay.
My
what happened?
study group. So there was a group of people that had been studying the text. And because my degree is in social work, I had no idea what I was. I mean, I was reading the text with them, but I really had no idea what I was reading. I'm like, ask Ada what? Like what? And so they had arranged actually to be there because they knew the guy who got you in to speak. And it's actually one of Pete Closey's friends, actually, that brought you in. But the point is that they had a whole 2-hour thing prior to you giving the talk that night. We hung out with you and asked questions, and I came in.
That was before the talk?
Yeah, because I had been ski instructing prior, so I got there late, and then I went up to you before we actually went over to the guy's house and had dinner, and then the talk. Anyway, whatever. The point is that I went up to you and asked, I just need to spread this, to anybody and everyone, and you gave me your business card, and I still actually have it. It's quite historic. I can't quite get myself to throw it away because it's all the little historic things that you're like, oh, this is
and then how did we go from that meeting to building a friendship? And then
actually, because you were invited back to Minnesota a lot.
I remember that. That's right.
Kathy Laird,
Kathy Laird.
bring you in a lot. And so anytime you came into town, I would come and listen to you. In fact,
Right.
I picked you up at the airport several times.
Right.
And drove you to the different places. And so I just made a habit of trying to come and be there. But then Margaret went to the JP2 Institute, and when you had moved back
This is a friend of
here-
yours
Yeah.
who
So
went to study where I studied
She
at
gave
the
me
JP2
the tapes.
Institute.
So
Right.
same Margaret, yep. So then she went to the JP2 Institute, and you had moved back here. And ultimately, or actually, no, when you were in Denver, I drove through Denver one time.
Oh, yeah, I remember
and
that.
stopped
And
to
was that
see-
when the first time you met my family?
Yes, and I could tell stories about Thomas.
So
But
what, Thomas was how old? Like 2 or 3 years
he was
old?
maybe 2. I don't know. He showed up with his underwear on backward because he had put them on himself. I just had to say it. I know this is public. I'm so sorry, Thomas.
Do you remember meeting Jen, Thomas?
It was so lovely.
Uh-huh.
But it's so lovely because even the way your children had been taught to anticipate a visitor, like they greeted me like they already knew me. And there was something about the way you raised your kids with this language that kept sucking me in deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And when I visited, I picked up Margaret and brought her back to Minnesota just for fun. You know, we did a little road trip and we stopped to see you as well. So there was just kind of this, because I had your business card, I was asking you questions via email. Right. I would call you once in a while. How do you say this? How do you do that? You know, whatever. And it was 2001 that I had listened to the tapes. It was January of 2002 that I met you in person in New Ulm. A week after I met you, I actually heard John Eldredge speak live at a Sacred Romance conference. Mm-hmm. And I gave my first talk a week after that. So literally 1 week increments.
Wow.
Yeah, February 14th, 2002. And I laughed because I literally blended what I was hearing from you and what I was hearing from John Eldredge. Like, he really emphasizes the story.
Yeah.
And I thought, you must have heard Christopher or somebody because you talk like you know theology of the body. So I went up and asked him, actually, he's like, you have no idea how many people ask me that. So I keep praying for him, but I just think, oh my goodness, like the Lord brought those pieces of the puzzle together and it melded into what I started to consider, I guess, my own unique way of presenting theology of the body. But anyway, that's jumping
and
ahead
then
a little
you
bit.
also attended our very first Theology of the Body Institute course.
Oh, yeah.
In the summer of 2004.
Yes.
What do you remember about that? It was
Road
right
trip.
here at Black Rock Retreat
Yeah.
Center.
Road trip. So again, I mean, I was at the time driving everywhere that I could because I loved driving everywhere. And so I camped down the road instead of staying here and blah, 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 whatever. But yeah, it was just such an amazing experience when you talk about the head and heart experience of your courses, that has been very deliberately fostered over the years. But I felt it even then that it was, in my mind, 100% a course, a class, and 100% a retreat.
Right.
And the integration of head and heart is very, very deliberate and very well done. And so it impacted everything that I had studied, and I had heard you speak on it, obviously. But it also helped me go deeper into the text because I, again, had studied it with friends, and I had been learning the vocabulary of philosophy and theology, which I had no background at all. I had never formally studied theology ever. And so that was actually how I learned it, was through my friends who have degrees in philosophy and theology that were studying the text. But then when I came to the course, it took your colloquial language and JP2's theological language and brought it together in yet another opportunity. Because honestly, your early tapes, the recordings even that we did for Ascension, the Created and Redeemed set, at that point, you were still integrating quite a bit of JP2's language when you spoke about it.
Right.
I mean, you've refined it and or just started to cater to the audiences and tried to give it a more broken down sense of, like, how do I talk to normal people about this? But when you first started talking about it, you had a lot more of the theological language in there.
Right.
And so that's really how I learned how to say eschatological. You know what I mean? It just rolls off your tongue now, right? Like eschatological. But I couldn't even say it. Eschato what? Eschato, I couldn't say it. So
I remember when I was first reading the text, and I called it concupiscence. And I was talking to this priest friend of mine. I was like, yeah, so I'm reading all about concupiscence with JP2. And he says, what? Do you mean concupiscence? Well, yeah, whatever, concupiscence. So yeah, there are all these fancy words in the text that you eventually get familiar with. I remember when I was first reading it in the early 90s, this was before Google or anything, I had to have a theological and a philosophical dictionary with me to look up these words. Like, what does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? So it is a very dense, obviously, scholarly text. People don't go around every day talking about concupiscence or eschatological man.
In his household they do, well, but
says my son Thomas. Yeah, our household was a little odd in that way. I remember Thomas teaching you the word concupiscence.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Do you remember that too?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was. I think. Well, I don't know. I thought. Well, I'm not gonna. I think if it's explained properly, it can be understood. I don't know why we need to fear these words.
Right. Agreed.
And you, let's fast forward a little bit. You took the course in 2004.
Right.
And then in 2005, you lived with our family for 6 months in a kind of internship / nanny-ish, helping us with our young kids. We had 3 really young ones, and I was traveling a lot. And this was kind of it was an attempt to help my wife in the early years of our parenting because of my crazy life where I was traveling so much.
Right.
And what do you remember about living with us for 6 months?
It was a huge blessing in so many ways. I mean, I got to see your humanity. I think that's helpful because I think there were so many people that were putting you on a pedestal, and I saw you as a friend because I had met you prior to you getting really big.
Right.
But it still was a thing that I think people thought of you in a particular way that was a little too perfect. And not to say that I saw horrible, grungy crap when I was living with you, but it was good to just see
you saw the behind the scenes that I'm just a normal guy trying to live a life.
Yeah.
And I got my own brokenness to deal with. And in fact, that time you lived with us, and you only came to really understand this a few years later. But it was a real time of trial in my life, in my marriage. It was the time that JP2 died. In fact,
we got to watch the funeral together.
I remember
4:00 in the morning. We were up on the couch.
I remember
the funeral.
February 13th.
Yes.
I was in the basement playing my drums, and you come running down, and you announced on February 13th. Do you remember this?
Yes.
You announced
that the last Fatima
Sister
Lucia
died.
Away.
And do you remember what I said?
I don't actually.
I said, this first words out of my mouth, when you said Sister Lucia died, I said, oof, JP2's next, and it's not going to be long.
Wow.
And he died, so that was
April
February
2nd.
13th. He died April 2nd.
Right.
And it was as if when John Paul II died, I remember the day I was giving a seminar outside of Philadelphia, and it was sometime in the afternoon. Somebody like sheepishly kind of raised a hand, and I could tell something was important. So I said yes, and he said, I just got the news that the Holy Father died.
Wow.
And I was right at the end of a Theology of the Body seminar, and it was a poignant moment. We all paused, the audience and I prayed.
Wow.
And then at the end, when I was signing some books, somebody, I'll never forget this, somebody came up to me and said, what are you going to do now? As if the work of spreading John Paul's teaching was now over.
That's
because
so
he was dead. And I my jaw kind of dropped. I was like, what am I going to do now? I said, this is not over. This is just beginning.
Right.
This is just the church is going to be unpacking this for centuries.
And now we have somebody praying
and
for
now
us
we
from
have
up there.
and
right.
Since you brought that up, this is what I really felt was going on in my personal life when you were living with us. JP2 dies. I felt like now JP2 in heaven was saying to me, not like I heard some voice, but there was an interior sense like, okay, Christopher, you've understood my theology pretty well, but now we got to do some real interior work to make it a lived reality.
Wow.
Because I did understand the theology well. I was able to write about it and teach it. But there was a big gap between what I understood in my head and what was going on in my interior life and in my marriage. And it is so important. You were saying earlier how it's and I do this. It's so easy to put the people we admire and the people who have inspired us, people who have taught us. We're so grateful to them. We end up, kind of thinking, oh, maybe they're above the normal, learning curve in humanity or something. It's just not true.
Right. I mean, it's a particular gift to have the ability to put things into words and to come up with the analogies. That's a gift from the Holy Spirit that you've been able to trailblaze, if you will, to help the rest of us grapple with his big theological work and put it into normal down-to-earth language.
Yeah.
And your boldness, as well as your earthiness, as well as your articulate reality of even your love of language and your love of the meaning of words, that all comes together in your gift. And so it's not that it doesn't need to be refined or something, but it is a particular trailblazing kind of gift. And when you do that, then there are people that are going to be like, oh. Yeah. And so to just recognize that, the gift is there, but it's...
And what's so important here, my own experience has borne it out over and over and over again, that just because you have an understanding of something or an ability to put it in words or speak about it or teach it, that does not necessarily translate into, well, therefore I'm living it.
Right.
And the analogy that my spiritual director gives, which I think is really helpful, is he talks about a car and the headlights. The headlights are ahead of the car. And the car is always catching up to where the headlights were.
Oh, right.
Right?
Yeah, wow. That's a cool analogy.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. Like that's the journey. And in my experience, I usually come to understand something first. That's the headlights out in front of the car. But then the car has to catch up to where the lights were, right? And I'm always playing that game. And that's not a game.
No.
But I'm always on that journey. I'm always moving. God, please, by your grace.
Right. No, yeah.
I want to be moving forward. John of the Cross says there's always more.
Yeah.
You can never claim I've arrived. I'm there.
Right?
There's
amen.
always, always, always more.
Yeah.
And we have such a misguided understanding here of holiness. I was just in Fatima and Spain leading a pilgrimage a couple weeks ago. And we are diving in really deeply to the life and teaching of St. Teresa of Avila.
So amazing.
And I had 40 pilgrims in front of me. I was giving lots of talks on the lives of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And I said to my group, true or false, Teresa of Avila was a wretched sinner deserving of hell. And there was people didn't quite know what to say. Is this a trick question?
Right.
But a good chunk of people said, well, false. She's a saint. Teresa of Avila herself said, I am a wretched sinner deserving of hell. And she says one of the greatest graces she was ever given was a vision of her place in hell.
Wow. I did not hear about that.
Yeah.
Oh
and
goodness.
when we have this false notion of sanctity and holiness, and this is a quote from Pope Benedict XVI. He says, we often have an all too idealized image of the saints.
Yeah.
And he points to St. Peter as an example. He says, for example, we tend to think of Peter as the rock after Pentecost and the denier before Pentecost. And he says, the truth is, Pope Benedict says, the truth is he was both rock and denier before and after Pentecost.
Oh, wow.
We gotta reckon with this because this all too idealized image of the saints it really ends in having an inhuman vision of holiness. And I said to my pilgrims, I said to the significant number who said, well, that's false. Teresa of Avila was not deserving of hell. Well, to say she's not deserving of hell is to say, in a sense, it's to say, well, she didn't need a savior, right? Saints are not perfect people.
Right.
They are people who know they are perfectly loved in all their imperfections.
Yeah.
And an image that Teresa of Avila herself uses, she says, you only see the spots on a glass when you hold it up to the light. And, don't we kind of roll our eyes when we hear, like Mother Teresa saying what a wretched sinner she is? We're like, yeah, sure.
What do you go to confession about?
Yeah, well, sure, Mother Teresa. No, but only a saint knows how
clearly.
sinful they are because they're holding their glass up to the light and they see all the spots.
Yeah.
I mean, St. Paul, this was just in the cycle of readings recently, St. Paul says, this is certainly something we can hold on to as true. Christ came to save sinners, and among sinners, I am the worst. That's biblical revelation, because that's Paul's letter in the New Testament, where Paul is saying he is the worst of one of the greatest saints in the world of all Christian history, says, I'm the greatest of all sinners. Right. This is the message. Christ came to save sinners. And I'm looping back to when you were living with us and JP2 died. Yeah. And I really felt like I had an intercessor in heaven who was saying, Christopher, you got the theology in your head, but hold that glass up to the light and let's start dealing with the spots. And it sent me on just a much deeper interior journey. Yeah. And you allowed, because you were present in the home, you gave space. Yeah, you would take the kids on walks to the creek. And Wendy and I would spend hours working through and talking through stuff that we really needed to look at in our marriage. So I'm so grateful to you, Jen. That was all providence that you were there. I mean, I honestly
remember, and I wish I had it with me. It'd be fun to look at it with you. But I had a journal that I was actually writing the providential pieces that I saw in the timing of when I lived with you. There were several things that was the year of something, you know what I mean? Like the Pope had declared it a year of something, and now I can't remember which one it was.
Oh yeah, I don't remember either. 2005.
I'd have to look back in my notes, but it was one of those times where I just saw this list of things that had happened, and very particularly like to see the timing of Luciana passing away.
Sister Lucia. Yeah.
My brain tripped to Pier Giorgio's sister, Luciana. But JP2's death, and to share that opportunity to watch the funeral with you, and to even to go skiing together in the winter, and to have the opportunity to see the weather shifting and the fun of this new place. But I will say, the fun that I have, because I love the outdoors, of taking your kids down to the creek for hours and knowing in retrospect, I mean, I knew that you were taking the time to have some conversations that needed to happen with Wendy, but to know the depth of what was going on there now was just very powerful, to see the combination of things. And it was such a fun time, because I mean, Beth was she was only a year and a half, so I was throwing her in the backpack. Yeah. Like the backpack. Like I still can hear her little voice. So cute. And just the adventures of I carved a zillion knives and swords for Thomas. Yeah. And it's just learning how to do the pocket knives. And
we still have, I think your collection is in the basement somewhere, isn't it?
I do have some of them, yeah.
I have a lightsaber you made for me it's next to the frame picture of your parents. So I pray for you. So just know that I'm praying for you, because your little lightsaber is up on my shelf.
I destroyed a Sharpie to paint that thing.
Oh my gosh. It's so great. So yeah, these are the things that I recognize the coordination of God the Grand Coordinator, and the fact that I honestly felt like I learned just as much from Wendy as I did from you. And I'm loving the fact that she's kind of emerging from the shadows by doing the podcast with you, because her voice in my head, as far as the experience of living with you and hearing how you applied theology of the body to children and worked through all the messiness of family life and arguments and whatever with your kids, trying to figure out how do you break that down into little person language. Yeah. That was my immersion experience. And both of you had such an amazing observation of your kids and what's going on in their head. Especially Wendy was always trying to figure out what's going on in my child's head, and how do I approach what is exactly going on inside of them right now, and approaching kids as persons. God bless my parents, but it was much more about just because I said so and that kind of stuff. And so
yeah.
to observe the way you treated your children as persons who can think and choose and have that independent, or not independent, but individual dignity, it was very profound. And Wendy's choice of words was always so amazing to me as well. You both have such a love of words.
Yeah.
And so I'm just very blessed to have both of you be a part of your podcast.
Thank you, Jen.
But
Yeah,
anywho.
it's a great gift to be working in ministry with my wife again after she and I did a lot together when we were newly married, and then the kids started coming, and she had to spend her time with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only been in the last few years that she's been able to come out and do the podcast with me. And she's going to be part of the pilgrimage next year to France.
So beautiful.
Yeah, Wendy's coming along. So if
Love
you
it.
want to go on a pilgrimage
And
with,
learn from Wendy West
learn
as
from
well.
Wendy West as well.
Yes.
Next October 2023, we're taking
Lovely.
a river cruise on
Wow.
the Seine River
Okay.
through France, and it's going to be themed on the Little Flower
Oh,
and St. Teresa's Little Way.
that's lovely.
And we're going to be merging John Paul's insights with St. Teresa's insights. It's going to be very exciting. But let's fast forward
Sure.
to your starting Into the Deep
Okay.
and talk
10
about
years. That would be a 10-year fast forwarding.
but talk about your love of the outdoors. Talk about how you took your love of the outdoors and your love of theology of the body and brought
Right.
them together in a really powerful mission and ministry, which is in no small matter modeled after the young Karol Wojtyła
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
himself and the way
Oh,
he
yeah.
would take young people out into God's creation.
Yes. And even just to connect the dots, honestly, the reality of, I said that the first time I gave a talk was 2002. I started the Frassati Society in 2003 because there were a bunch of young adults that had been studying JP2's text that also were really interested in just doing things together. And
So talk about Giorgio Frassati
so
and
blessed
how
Pure Giorgio Frassati, big time. He was actually somebody that John Paul II admired because JP2 was born in 1920. Pure Giorgio was a young man, died in 24 of polio. So he had just
died in 1924.
in 1924. So he was born in 1901. He
Oh,
was
wow.
young. He actually, so he's known because he was so eclectic in his interests. He was all about doing, he was involved in everything on the university campus, from service of the poor to, political action to whatever. But he was big into the outdoors, and he was a downhill skier. He was into hiking, etc. And he would bring his friends on all these excursions. And he would bring, spiritual reading, and he'd read it at the top of the mountain, or he'd say the rosary while he was hiking up the mountain, or he wouldn't go on a trip unless he had a priest so that they would have mass on Sunday, kind of thing. He wouldn't, miss mass just to go into the woods, kind of thing. So actually he was a role model to JP2 because his reputation was so big. He died a week before he graduated from college. He contracted polio from one of the poor he had served.
Wow.
And his parents were wealthy. His dad was a diplomat, and his dad also ran the La Stampa. It's an Italian paper that was anti-fascist. And so they were only on that page that much, but his parents weren't really practicing their faith. When Pier Giorgio died, though, they see it as the first miracle, if you will, that his parents didn't actually split up and they kind of came back into their faith. His sister Luciana actually had one sister, Luciana, and she married a guy from Poland. So they had 6 kids. And now she's in Rome. All 6 of the kids are still alive, but she's still promulgating his cause, etc.
Wow.
And
how did you discover Frassati?
JP2 saw his value, and there was a kind of a patronage thing at World Youth Day. So he was a patron of World Youth Day, and he still is.
So was this in Toronto?
So 2002, Toronto, yeah. And there was a huge display that described Pier Giorgio's life and some of the aspects of it. He had been attracted to this girl but didn't act on it because his mom would have disapproved. Like, there's all these things that you're like, this is kind of an interesting person. But he was just so attractive. He was a practical joker, and I mean, just a lot of things that were very attractive as a well-rounded person. So one of my friends had started a Frassati Society in Denver, and we started one in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I ended up, running it with a few of my friends. Basically, we just started attracting. There weren't a lot of young adult groups in the Twin Cities at that time, and so that was a huge magnet. It got going. I was the one that knew the outdoor skill set because I had grown up with it, and we ultimately just started doing service things or prayer things. We'd go out and pray, in front of the abortion clinic, but then we would have Versati nights. So we would go out, do an hour of adoration, and then we would go out to a pub. And so it was just a very organic camaraderie kind of based thing. That gave me the impetus, because I used to do a lot of outdoor stuff with my family. Then I started doing outdoor things just kind of by myself because I didn't have people in my life that were interested. Then I put the word out to the Catholic circles, hey, I'm starting this thing, or we are starting this thing. And it was a magnet. We had probably 500 people on the email list and all these people, so we were doing camping trips in the summer. Well, then I was like, well, I don't know, which national parks haven't I been to that I would like to go to? So I started leading people on these trips. Well, this is 2003 all the way through to 2015. I had involvement with that.
You're running the Versati Society?
The Versati Society.
And Into
I
the Deep came...
So I gave my first talk in 2002.
Uh-huh.
I knew that this would be a good idea to blend them. I saw it in action when I was sitting around the fire with people and we're having laughter, deep conversation, silence, whatever. You sit around a fire and it's just this lovely combination of organic whatever happens, And I just saw how good it would be instead of just a 1 hour talk. What if I could get people to come on like a 5-day camping trip and just get them away from things? Because it was also the tipping point of people getting cell phones. When I moved in with you in 2005, I got my first cell phone only because I didn't want to give your personal home number out to everybody. But that was a new thing. That wasn't even like everybody has a cell phone. It was the tipping point was right around then.
Yep.
And I observed that people were bringing them on the trip, and it was such an intrusion into the silence and the type of conversation that I was like, whoa, it put a light on in my head that I don't think this is just for fun. Like, I think that God wants me to do this. I mean, of course it's fun, but I just knew there was more to it. And I didn't know the fullness of what cell phones would do to our society until later. But it was a definite thing that I thought, I think there's something to this, that I need to ponder bringing theology of the body and the outdoors into something. And Margaret and I, actually my friend Margaret, we had talked about starting something. She then felt called to California. I was too afraid to start a nonprofit at the time, but I started putting my feelers out. And one of the things I recognized is I have to have better credentials because I have a social work degree, but I never got licensed. I've been a substitute teacher and I teach about theology of the body, but I don't have a licensure in education, nor have I ever studied theology. So I actually went back to school, got my master's in theology, and started Into the Deep while I was sort of under the cover of, I'm working on my master's.
Right.
Because I was so freaked out about it. I don't want to do this. I don't want to run a business. I don't want to raise money. I don't want to do any of this. I just want to give talks. I just want to So, and if I could just lead people on trips. Well, in the meantime, probably 2006, I had actually started leading camping trips with the youth group at my parish as well. So, and that was a tipping point too of all the liability stuff with the scandal having been in the past 5 years before that. All these new rules were being implemented. And I seriously think God had me do 10 years of experimental trips with my friends and the youth group to get me through the attitude of like, why are we doing these things? What the heck? Because it did feel like it was intrusive to just the personal relationships that you usually have. It's normal now, but at the time it just felt like, what? 2 adults in every vehicle, that ruins this, and that, you have to do this and that and the other thing. But that is what led to then 2012, I got my nonprofit status and then graduated from my master's program in 2013 and did my first trip with Christopher and his 2 sons, Thomas and John Paul.
Was that your first official trip? With
2014
into
to the
deep?
Adirondacks.
Oh my gosh, remember that,
Thomas?
That was
the very first trip I actually ran through. Into the deep.
Wow.
So I had to do all the learning curve of how to do liability paperwork and a website and all the fun things about money and whatever. But
I want to encourage our viewers, even right now, to pause the video and click the link in the description below to watch a kind of promotional video for Into the Deep. And you'll see for yourself the exciting work that Jen is doing, taking people into the outdoors and sharing theology of the body in that context. So pause right now, watch that video, and then come back, and we're going to share more.
Love it.
So I'm going to venture a theory here. And I never quite put this together until right now as you were talking. You were saying that you grew up going into the outdoors. And I know a lot about this because I've known you for so long, that you had this cabin in northern Minnesota
Yes.
then your family still has
Still
it,
has,
and you
yes.
would go there every summer.
For a whole month.
For a whole month, no electricity,
Right.
no
No plumbing.
no plumbing,
No roads.
no roads.
Right.
So how would you get to this cabin?
Boat.
Boat.
We'd take a boat.
Take a boat. So you were doing this every year.
Yes.
This was just part of your life, part of your
Part of the
experience
fabric.
growing up, the
Yep.
very fabric of your understanding of your family, the world. And here's the theory that I'm going to hold out there. You see if it resonates. I believe that your attraction to theology of the body when you first encountered it was the fruit of your love of creation that was fostered in your family in those trips to the cabin.
Goosebumps. Yeah.
And here's
Yeah.
what I want to hold out, and I'd love to hear you speak into it, that those experiences of being without electricity, without running water, having to get to the cabin on a boat, you're going out into nature like more than most people experience in the
Right.
modern world.
Right.
And you're having to survive in the rhythms of nature in a way that we don't with lights and electricity. And I believe that really got in your heart in touch as a young girl with what the church calls sacramentality, that God communicates his mystery through the natural realities of creation.
Yeah.
And at the pinnacle of sacramentality is the human body.
Yeah.
So as a little girl, you're getting a catechesis whether you knew it or not.
Wow.
Just in
Yeah.
the smell of the pine needles, in what it takes to light a campfire, in your love of the water, in your love of the sunset and the sunrise and the sound of the
Yes.
crickets, and
Climbing on rocks. Yeah.
and
The
all
breeze
that
yeah.
you did in God's creation was fine-tuning your heart to be sensitive to a divine encounter through the reality of creation.
Yeah.
That's sacramentality.
Yeah.
You said you got chills, so I'm thinking that's probably a confirmation
Beautiful.
that I'm
I've
onto
never-
something here.
Never occurred. I mean, that has never crossed my mind.
But it
it's
went
real.
full circle. So
Yeah.
I would hold this out that your love of creation, your love of nature, brought you to the theology of the body, and then your love of theology of the body said, I have to share this. How
Yeah.
can I share this? I'm going to share this by bringing people out into nature. The very way that your heart was prepared to receive the beauty and goodness of the theology of the
Yes.
body, you instinctively
Yes.
said, I want to recreate experiences like this for others
people,
so that
because
they
don't-
can
yeah.
encounter God in his creation.
Right. Because part of what I was seeing is people saying, I've always wanted to try this, but I didn't know how. And I'm like, well, I have the skill set. I can help lead, But I also recognized that part of what I wanted to share was the silence that people don't usually create for themselves, the long periods of silence. Because my parents never wanted us to bring things that were battery operated because they're like, well, we're just going to waste a bunch of batteries and
Right.
you eat them up, and we're not going to do that. So we didn't have like our battery operated radio or whatever. I mean, we just sang songs off the radio, amongst the siblings and whatever, but it was a silence that honestly I had no idea how unique it was until I got to college and I started chatting with people and like, what, a whole month? How did you live with that kind of,
Yeah.
away from this, and this? And it's like, I packed my bags like a week or month or whatever in advance because I was so excited,
That's awesome.
So that's the thing. It was a silence that actually catered to, and partially because I'm the youngest of the 6 in my family, 6 kids, we were all there for the whole time, but I was the last one. So then the summers when my siblings started to work, they were in college, so they're working and just coming up on the weekends. I was the only one there for a whole month for 4 years, because I have 4 years before my other siblings,
Right.
So that was so formative because I had to make a decision. Okay, am I going to just stay in the front and sit on the shore, or am I going to venture back into the woods by myself? Of course I can walk with my dad, but we're all doing our own thing, and I had to make a decision. And I distinctly remember the irrational stuff that pops up into your head, animals jumping out at you, whatever, images from movies.
Right.
And just thinking, okay, is that real or not? Am I going to...
Lions and tigers and bears, oh my.
It's fascinating, because I wasn't even a horror movie watcher. And so it was interesting to do what I now know is battle to, am I going to be comfortable in God's creation, or am I going to be afraid of it?
Yeah.
And so I pushed myself to walk by myself into the places that I had previously walked with my siblings, and to find them and not just be like, well, I don't know where that is exactly. I'm afraid to explore. It's like, well, I kind of know the landmarks. I think I can do this, so it was a process. But then once I got into those spaces, like the overlooks that we would walk to, or the whatever, we had a lot of glacial rock up on it's called the Canadian Shield. There's a lot of rock up in that area. And just sitting there, like surrounded by beauty, darn well that God has created it all and that he's with you. I mean, at least in my logic, it's like, well, of course, but you're sitting there and you have to make a decision. It's like, well, I suppose I could talk to you. And that is my very first memory of personal prayer, if you will.
Wow. Beautiful.
Of just sitting there and being like, I suppose I could talk to you.
Beautiful. Wow, Jen.
And I tell kids that when I give, or even adults, because I do different things on trips to give them space to just be by themselves. And that's what I use as an example. It's, I suppose I could talk to you, just say hi, do something, open the door to a conversation, because that is what ultimately led to just the contemplation of just sitting there and being with God, which was actually, I would say, accentuated by then long road trips. When I drove to Alaska, I drove out east, I drove to the West Coast, I drove all these places before I had a cell phone. You have to get comfortable with yourself. And honestly, you get sick of listening to music, and you even get sick of trying to do formal prayers. That's all I knew at that point was like, okay, I'll try and say a rosary, I guess.
Right.
You get sick of all that, and you just have to sit and be. And for hours, and if I had not been pushed to do that for days, I mean, it takes longer than just maybe a weekend retreat, which is why it's hard to see that I can only offer just a glimpse of what can really be possible when you press yourself to live with a little bit of that uncomfortable silence for
I'm going to go even further in my theory here. And I'm going to propose, because this is all coming together even deeper for me as you're talking. I believe that month at that cabin, year after year after year, in silence and stillness, no electricity, no phones, no running water, that taught you contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
The stillness of it, the kind of forced quiet. And I think it's Blaise Pascal who said, all of man's problems have to do with the fact that he can't sit still quietly in a room.
Wow. Yeah.
And Bill Dunahee, my colleague here at the Institute, often quotes that. And you were taught by your parents about the importance of stillness and quiet, and you came to look forward to it. Contrast that with a friend of mine who took a youth group away for a weekend camp out and required that they leave their cell phones behind.
Yeah.
And this 14-year-old boy, like going into almost like drug withdrawal from not having his phone.
Yeah.
Not being able to do this all the time. Like his whole world is right here.
Right.
That is. I mean, thank God for these things, right? We can do so much with them, and they're a tool
Blessing
that can
and a
be
curse.
used for great good.
Yeah.
But when we are stuck in only this world,
Yeah.
that is dangerous. It is anti-contemplation, right? It is the reverse of what you were learning year after year with a month in the woods in a cabin. And that stillness, that openness, I guess I could talk to you. And then you actually learn how to hear him talking back.
Yes.
And you start to hear his call on your life. And you start to recognize that's the voice of my father. Oh, that's the voice of an enemy.
Yes.
This is the voice that is affirming my identity as Jen. This is a voice that is attacking my identity as Jen. And you get to understand the difference. And, Jesus says,
Spot
my
on.
sheep know my voice and they
Yes.
follow. Well, you can't
Wow.
know his voice if you don't know how to be still
Yeah.
and quiet
Yeah.
and listen. And the noise of our modern world is blocking us from hearing,
Yeah.
blocking us from tuning in to the way the Lord is speaking to our hearts. And when I think of my friend Jen Messing, like if I were to picture your heart, I can't understand you. I can't comprehend you. I don't know who you are apart from that cabin.
Mm-hmm.
The stories you've told, the light in your eyes, the joy that comes out of you when you talk about your experience going to that cabin.
Yeah.
It's just part of you. It's part of the fabric of your life. And it speaks profoundly of incarnational, sacramental reality.
Yes.
And I've said to you many times, one of these days, I want to go to this cabin.
I know. I
And
was just
and
thinking
I'm
about that again.
renewing it. I'm renewing it. I want to take my family with you sometime to this cabin because
I love it.
it's a sacramental sign of your own heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I will know you better by visiting that place because you can't understand yourself apart from that place. And anybody who really knows you doesn't know you apart from that place. Why am I pressing into this? Because these sacred things, your cabin, maybe it's a favorite vacation spot that you went to as a boy or as a girl. I have those kind of places too. I think of the beach house that we would go to in my childhood. I think of the many camping trips my dad took me on. I think of the southern end of Lancaster County where I now live, but to the west and the Susquehanna River. This was my go-to spot as a boy. Like, that was the place of adventure. Why? Because when I was little, my dad would take me camping in that part of the county. And it just became this place that called to me. And that's a very sacred spot to me. I've taken you many times to Holtwood Pinnacle, looking over the Susquehanna River.
Yes.
That's a sacred place to me. The
Yeah.
smell of those woods,
Yes.
the sound of those creeks.
Yes.
And I just want to hold out to our viewers, what are the places in God's creation that sing to you? Is it the beach? Is it the mountains? Is it a cabin like Jen had this experience? Can you think of a favorite tree that you loved to climb when you were a kid? Or was there a little place in the corner of your yard that you loved to go and play? The point here is that God woos us through his creation.
Yes.
And this is the whole point of your ministry,
Yeah.
Into the Deep.
Yeah.
Nature, I would say your love of nature prepared you to love the theology of the body. Your love of theology of the body brought you to a love for others that you wanted to share this with them. And your own context in understanding it was God's creation. And you said, I'm going to start a ministry to take people out into God's creation to encounter theology of the body. So tell us about some of your most exciting adventures you've gone on. I've gone on 2 of them with you, to the Adirondack Mountains, and then we did one that I came along to Alaska. What have been some of your favorite adventures, and what have been some moments where you thought, I know I'm doing what God has called me to do, and I'm seeing the fruit of it in other people's lives, and we're encountering adversity, but at the same time we're encountering, even in the adversity, we're encountering faces of God.
Right.
Share some of those adventures and experiences.
That's hard to narrow down, I will say. My thoughts were actually on just to say it out loud, my thoughts were really contemplating the fact that I've never thought about the fact that I learned discernment of spirits. I started learning discernment of spirits from that time of being at the
And
cabin.
by that, just for our
Just
viewers,
saying,
you mean, I know this is the Father's voice,
Right.
and I know this is the enemy's voice.
Right.
That's discernment of spirits. That's
Right.
what we mean by discernment
and
of spirits.
my heart was just pondering that, so I'm trying to shift
Shift gears.
But
Well,
that was
if
really...
you want to talk
Well,
about that first, and then jump to some of your favorite adventures
Sure.
you've been on.
I mean, just to even speak to that for a second, because when you talk about the sacramentality of something, right? So one of my favorite sounds is the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, specifically through white pine and red pine, which grow in northern Minnesota, right?
The
there's
fact
a
that you even know the distinction.
Oh yeah, it's an
is beautiful.
amazing low sound of just it's beautiful. And the funny thing of not having running water is there's a particular way you brush your teeth. You just go out back with a cup of water and you're like, there's a spot that we spit, whatever. But I'm like standing there brushing my teeth.
And you'd hear the
looking
wind.
up into the trees. And I remember that was like the first memory I have of seemingly God planting an insight directly from his voice into my heart. The watching the trees blow in the wind. And it was this whole you stay rooted in your faith and you stay rooted in God, but let the Holy Spirit blow wherever it wills.
Amen.
That was one of my first spiritual
Beautiful.
insights, if you
Beautiful.
will. And so I just try to open the door for people to have those experiences. But as you ask about highlights and hard things that have happened, so a phrase I coined actually on that very first trip that we did to the Adirondacks, one of the biggest lessons I learned was on that first trip, where I can know what I know. I can prepare, risk management wise. I can know the skill set of the outdoors, and I can try and prevent things from happening. But, we're all fallen, and things happen that you can't predict. You don't know how people are going to do on the hike. You don't know if everybody's actually going to be fit enough to do it, etc. And even if they are fit enough, there's things that happen. And so I recognized on that trip, it's like, wow, I can't protect people from what God might be trying to teach them.
Right.
Through my own fallenness, through just events, people hiking at different paces.
Yep.
Oh my goodness, that drives people mad. When they're a fast walker and there's somebody that's slower, it's so interesting to watch how there's stuff that you just have to be like, God is teaching people things that are hard.
Well, you know what I remember about that trip so well? And speaking of people hiking at different paces, remember Monique?
Yes. Oh, yes.
And she was afraid that she wasn't even going to be able to get up the mountain. She thought she wasn't in good enough shape to do it.
Right.
But people really rallied around her and helped her to do
praying
it.
the rosary together as we were walking up.
We were walking up. And there were hard moments of that climb where I was wondering, is she going to make it? Yeah. But people really rallied around, and it was an experience of communion in that suffering that got her to the top of the mountain and got her down. Yeah. And remember, it was so late getting back. We got to that parking. Do you remember this, Thomas?
The fallenness of Jen's. Yeah, poor
we got back to the
timing.
parking lot. We had dinner out in the parking lot, and there was somebody had a guitar.
Yes,
and we were singing songs in the parking lot under the moonlight. Oh, it was beautiful.
Those things that people named it as being one of the highlights of the trip, and I was feeling humiliated, thinking, "Oh my gosh, I just completely led people up a mountain without enough time to get back down before sunset." And but
that was part of the adventure. That was part of the lesson that the Lord was teaching us, that we needed to band together, support one another, and we did. And the fruit of that was a communion among the group that brought a great joy and celebration. I mean, that was celebration in that parking lot.
It was. And that's what I've seen that over and over. When you ask for examples, it's hard because that happens so frequently on these trips. And not every single time is it quite as dramatic, but this past summer I did a trip in Wyoming, and it was a backpacking thing, and we had a pretty tough deal that we were dealing with when we came down from a peak. We just had a steeper than we thought it was going to be kind of descent. And just the experience of, I spontaneously decided I'm going to pray out loud over everybody. I was in the back, and I started praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet from behind. And they told me later, they're like, I was so irritated. I didn't want to. I couldn't focus on anything but where my feet were going, But they said, but it was so consoling to hear your voice praying over us. And as a spiritual mother is what I would consider myself to be in these situations. I am just going with the moment of like, what is happening right now? How can I receive the gift, but also, be attentive to how God is trying to teach them, and how can I help them through whatever it is that they're going through? And that's where, there have been times where one time I just had this spontaneous desire to yell the Memorare at the top of my lungs because people were having a really hard time. And I was like, remember, oh, most gracious Virgin Mary. And it was like hilarious because these people that were like feeling like they were ready to give up, they're like, okay, all right, we can do this. You know what I mean?
Never was it known.
Right, never was
anyone
it known.
who implored your help or sought your intercession was left unaided.
Anyone, so it is fascinating how every scenario you're discerning what is needed here, like, and you are dealing with your own fallenness and your own miscalculations and other people, that think they're going to be fine. I had a guy that hadn't been drinking enough water and was dealing with altitude all at the same time.
Gosh.
And puking his guts out and
dear.
and it's just like, oh, wow. And he's, fit person. Altitude stuff hits, it doesn't matter if you're fit or not. Like, so that's the thing. Stuff happens and you are, okay, we're all sitting around for an hour waiting. What can we do? And you're discerning, am I going to let just organic conversation? People are just chatting. Or should I try and do some kind of TOB insight? And I started to do some kind of a TOB insight thing and people were just not in the mode. And I was like, all right, just drop that. So it's a fascinating journey of literally discerning in the moment, what am I going to insert? And
I've seen you doing that, and you're very good at it.
That's beautiful.
I've seen you like reading the group and reading the environment and saying, we got to pivot this way or we got to pivot that way. And you're very skilled.
Thank you.
And I know you're well trained. You had to get all kinds of certifications to.
Well, I did what's called a NOLS, National Outdoor Leadership School. So I did a NOLS course, 3 weeks of backcountry stuff that it solidified my skill set because I had learned all the Minnesota skills of like canoeing and portaging and northern Minnesota hiking and but I had only followed people in the mountains and I'd followed people in winter settings. And so I did a NOLS trip that was in the spring in the mountains. So we were basically in the snow the whole time. And so I learned more of the mountaineering, mountain, glacier, snow kind of skills to just know how to lead in that scenario. So it was a little more of a well-rounding of my skill set. But it also does the credential thing, kind of like getting a master's in theology. It's like, okay, now I actually have studied this. Even though I've done these things my whole life, okay, here, now I've cleaned up my understanding of some things and refined it. And it definitely was worth it. I mean, both my master's in theology and doing the NOLS trip, I don't feel like it was like, oh, that's just for show. It's like, no, God definitely refined my knowledge and my ability to understand how all these things are interconnected, to articulate them, risk management, blah, blah, blah. And even, when I was on the NOLS trip, we were navigating by a map. We did not have a phone that was telling us where we were going. Right. We didn't have a GPS device. We were using a compass and a map and no trails. So that was the specific skill set that I was very grateful for on that trip. We had to take turns leading and telling people how long we thought it was going to take, et cetera. And, even there you run into the stuff of, oh, easy day. We just have to get down to this trail and we're going to a campsite where we're going to get picked up and get a re-ration and blah, blah, blah. And, oh, by the way, there's been a storm and there's trees all over the trail. And, oh, you get to the bridge that's supposed to cross this raging creek and the bridge is out. And you have to do this. The instructors were doing what's called a Tyrolean, this rope situation where we had to like pulley ourselves across the creek. I mean, and 7 hours later, you're, hiking into camp. So these are the things that shaped me enough that I feel confident at least to get out and do what I do. But there are a lot of things that I'm not officially certified in. This summer I specifically went through core expeditions because they have certifications in like rock climbing. So we had that as a portion of our backpack. We did a day of rock climbing and then backpacking. And the lessons that go along with every sort of activity, the rock climbing especially, there's such a physical, spiritual parallel with trying to figure out where you're going to grab hold, what's the route you're going to take, and what's going to hold and what's not. And you don't think you can hold on and you think you're not strong enough. And yet you find yourself making your way to the top, or you fall. Well, you've got anchors and ropes holding you and people that are behind you cheering you on. I mean, there's an incredible spiritual analogy to rock climbing.
Absolutely.
That I really do wish I could lead that more, but I don't have the official certification for that. But it's lovely to have the variety of I do some backpacking that's backcountry, and then I do base camping where you're just doing the ease of having one place and you go out and you do hikes every day. I do canoeing trips because I love being on the water, but I have found that's harder to draw people to. I never thought it would be. I thought that would be like, doesn't everybody want to go to the Boundary Waters? Like, come on. Boundary Waters being in the northern part of Minnesota, the entire northern part of Minnesota is all lakes, and they're close enough together that you only have to hike a short ways to get to the next lake. And so, but I've found that I do think that this whole media laden upbringing of people has taken the edge off of people's desire for adventure, because they watch it so they feel like they're participating in it. Well, their bodies are almost feeling, their bodies are feeling tired and lazy after work or whatever they're doing. They're just tired. They want to sit. So then they watch the adventure. They feel like they've already participated. Whereas in the past, we didn't have that. So everybody wanted to go camping. Everybody wanted to try stuff that was an adventure. And granted, there are still tons of people, but I'm finding more and more I've got a heavy population of homeschoolers that are coming on my trips, because they're still fostering, go play outside, get off no, you're not going to sit on a device. You're not going to watch this, that, and the other thing. You're not going to live vicariously through watching it. You're going to actually get out and experience it. And they want their kids to physically experience these things. And the kids, I find their spirits are more alive when they've been prompted to get outside and play. The kids that are a little more maybe dead to the physical experience of adventure are like, that's kind of scary. I don't know what I think of that. I'm not sure I want to exert myself that much. Yeah. And canoeing is a whole nother level, because it's a skill of actually having to steer and use your upper body muscles. Like who does that, So I've actually had a really hard time finding people to come on the canoeing trips.
Well, I want to invite you guys to go on a canoeing trip with Jen.
Because I would rather lead a canoe trip than just a plain hiking trip, seriously.
Check out the links we have and learn more about Jen's ministry. We're going to take a short break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk about your latest challenge and adventure.
Right on.
You're going through breast cancer.
Indeed.
And how that is all playing out. So maybe you know someone who's dealing with cancer. This next segment of our time together, I think, will be very enlightening. But in the meantime, as we take our break, check out those links to find out from Jen and her ministry what kind of retreats she has coming up. She's following in awesome footsteps here. She's following in the footsteps of John Paul II himself, who would take young people out into the wilderness to encounter the goodness of the Creator. We'll be back in just a few minutes. So, we are on. So we've been chatting here, Jen Messing and I, about Into the Deep. And do you want to say a little bit about the name Into the Deep before we switch to our next topic? Because I've always thought that was a really good name, because you have kind of a play on words, ID, Into the Deep, ID, identity,
Right.
all that. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you kind of summarized it, but yes, that's the reality of thinking through what do I call this thing. It was coined through prayer, and that was what I sensed came to me as far as helping people to go into the deep of who they are. The whole casting out into the deep is actually an evangelization call too. The fact that I was looking for something that had an acronym that was easy, it struck me in the middle of the luminous mysteries, actually, that that while I was living with you, actually, with you and your family, the whole ID, into the deep, oh my gosh, into the deep identity. And so that's, yeah. But it's funny because for years before I started it, I thought into the deep retreats or ID retreats, and then when I started it, it was somebody that helped me start the nonprofit end of it was like, well, you want it to be able to be whatever God expands it to be. So to just simply not relegate it to retreats, but to simply call it Into the Deep. And I was like, huh.
And your logo is a fingerprint.
Yeah.
Which also speaks of our uniqueness,
right.
Our unrepeatable humanity.
Yes.
So I want to talk about this latest stage of your life's journey, which is
learning theology of the body under a microscope. Yes.
Yes, with cancer.
Yes.
Tell us about your experience of learning that you had breast cancer and what this has meant for your life for the last, has it been a year and a half?
Yeah, it was March of 21. Fascinatingly, and this is not, I don't know, any sign of some kind of holiness or anything. It's funny that when I found out about it, it was actually more like, well, I'm kind of excited to see you, Lord, so sure, let's do it, But I just laugh because it kind of struck me as like, wow, this is going to be an interesting adventure.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. And honestly, there were other things swirling around me at that time that were a lot more traumatic than that. So I just think, what in the world, that I would have such a calm reaction to it still surprises me. I mean, I look back on it and I think, wow.
Was that confrontation with the possibility of dying at a young age, though? I'm sure it wasn't just, I can't wait to see you, Lord.
Well, that was my first reaction, was like, sweet, I can't wait to hang out with you. But then
I'm sure you're wrestling through all the other emotions.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I have had an exceptional number of adventures in my world. Like I really have I've done a lot of traveling, and I've had a lot of crazy stories that I could tell, and even vocational discernment, the fact that I'm not married, still I had all these different realities of things unfolding in my life, and looking at, sisterhood and marriage was a possibility a couple times, and then, consecrated virginity. Oh, I guess I'm not doing that either, And so honestly, it's just like yet another twisty turny. What is like, wow, this is a doozy. Okay, well, here we go. And I think some of the reality of, and I say this not with the despair of like, but life is tiring. Life is, you're kind of like, I've lived a really full, beautiful life. I'm okay. Like I've kind of contended with the fact that, especially contemplating Pier Giorgio's life.
Who died at age 23.
24, yeah. I mean, he was a week from graduating from college. And honestly, through the craziness of my vocational discernment, I've had to ask the question, is, the reality of not having a vow in place, that does not define your personhood. Right. It is not the start of your life. You have to launch into your life from wherever you're at, so like your life started when you were conceived. It's a matter of you deciding to just go forward and live. And I had to look at Pier Giorgio's life and go, well, okay, was that a waste that God decided to take him at the age of 24 when he was a week away from graduating from college? No.
Yeah.
No. And I've used that example so many times prior to this even happening that I had to just sit there and go, all right, well, here we go. And I have allowed that truth to sink so deeply into my heart that I never had a crisis of like, oh my gosh, I'm not ready to die. It was much more of a like, oh, fun. I get to
get to
maybe get to see the Lord.
You get to see the glory.
I maybe, and then it's interesting though as it unfolds, because I mean, it's not an instant death sentence, especially with breast cancer. It can be an indefinite battle. It can be a one and done, people get surgery and it's done or whatever. You don't know until you walk it out yourself what your story is going to be. And so you kind of have to sit back and embrace not knowing on some level. And that was harder than anything. I didn't really hit a crisis mode until May, when it was kind of this decision point of, do I keep doing, which, we can talk about, but like I had chosen to start trying some naturopathic things, dabbling in it because I had friends that had done these things. And then I knew people that had gone the other route of full out chemo and surgery.
Right.
And I had thought, well, maybe I'll do surgery and maybe I could try and avoid chemo by eating different or something, and internally I thought, I don't know that that's really enough to fight cancer, but I'll try it, and then because the Alaska trip was April of 21.
Yeah. And you had just learned.
Do I still do life and this stuff? Like, I feel fine. Like, you know what I mean? It was weird because it was just like one day you find a lump and you're like, oh, there's something growing in my body that shouldn't be growing there. I feel fine. I'm not sick, but you have to think about, what does this mean and how are you going to tackle it? Well, I didn't do chemo at right away, and I still haven't actually. But at the time, I was debating, what am I going to do? Do I get surgery? Do I have to? Does it matter? You start asking all these questions, and the doctors were like, well, it's probably fine to wait until after this trip. Cause I thought, okay, if I could do it before after this trip and before my summer trips, then maybe I can still, whatever, I'm just like, do I stop life? I don't know. Like, well,
has it slowed you down? You look healthy.
No, that's the beauty of it, is that because I've done the naturopathic route, it hasn't made me sick at all. And so, I'm still battling it, but it hasn't changed my pattern of events. I
know it's a very personal decision, and
you
said it would be okay to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I asked you ahead of time. Yeah. I also want to say just to our viewers here that this is not the Theology of the Body Institute advocating that this is the right approach or the only approach, but to help people make informed decisions, it's good for people to know there are alternatives to the traditional, conventional approach to dealing with cancer, which is, thank God, it saves lives oftentimes, but there's a cost to chemotherapy.
Yeah.
There's a cost to that conventional way. You made a personal decision to go an unconventional direction in your treatment. Speak into that. How did you discover this approach, and has it been, in your experience, has it been helpful?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just even knowing, like I said, putting theology of the body under a microscope.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because of the body-soul combo thing, that we are constantly dealing with the fact that nothing is ever just spiritual, nothing is ever just physical.
Because we're this marriage, a profound marriage of the spiritual and physical. It only makes sense. JP2 says the body is the outward sign of the inner spiritual mystery. Right? So it's never just something physical, and it's never just something spiritual. There's always a meeting point.
Right.
You're experiencing this in your battle with cancer. How are you seeing it? You say big time. Give an example or help our viewers to understand what you mean by that.
Step one was taking the options that were laid out before me by doctors and such, and the conversations that I had with multiple friends, you did this, why, what did you experience, etc. Sitting in adoration and thinking that I was going to, do surgery, but then try this stuff. And I just had this deep sense of like, stop and ask questions. And to have that sense of, oh, I suppose, because they do usher you down the path pretty fast when it comes to surgery and chemo. And I think that's probably the best thing I could have ever followed suit with, as far as God prompting, like, just simply ask questions. It wasn't a directive of how to go about it, but I started asking questions. And honestly, the more I got into it, the more I saw wow, this stuff is way more scientific than I ever thought. I
This
didn't
stuff,
think
what
this
meaning?
stuff, as in like naturopathic stuff. I mean,
Oh,
you start going
can you
down the
define
route.
that term?
Right. I
Because
don't have a great definition for like homeopathic, naturopathic. I actually don't know how to distinguish those terms. Really,
Mm-hmm.
I have a naturopathic doctor, so she actually has a doctorate in naturopathic medicine, so I can say that. But I don't know how to define. Like
But it's an
homeopathic
alternative,
versus,
just in
but it's-
layman's terms, it's an alternative to the chemosurgery path.
Right.
And what are what have been the treatments that you have used?
Lots of things. I mean, everything from a light frequency thing that is long to describe, but it's basically, it like targets things that the analogy, it's kind of like sound shattering a glass, right?
Mm-hmm,
It's meant to, the light frequencies are meant to shatter, if you will, the viruses and or like cancer cells, etc. I've been using one of those. I've been taking supplements. I changed the way that I eat. So dairy, gluten, sugar, blah, soy, the whole long list of things that I eliminated out of my diet, which was quite the process. It took Lent to do that, actually. I will say that. I actually found out right around Lent. So that was very providential because I honestly don't know that I would have done it. And it's been in stages. I mean, you can't do it all cold turkey, but it is all about trying to get your own immune system to do what it's supposed to do rather than, and this is not meant to be a judgment statement, but literally this is how they describe it. Chemo is meant to poison the cancer to the point where it won't kill you first. Like that's literally how they weigh it. They try to not kill you first. They try to kill the cancer. So it makes you very, very sick because it is poison.
Poison, right.
And it is basically killing everything in your immune system that can do anything to help you. And so you have to choose which way are you going to go. And that's ultimately what I faced was they can give you statistics and they will give you very forceful statistics when you meet with doctors and oncologists. They do their job well. They know what they're doing. However, I will say that they always give you the negative of the statistics. So if you don't do this, this is your percentage. If you do this
is the risk of not doing
right.
this. This is the chance of death if you don't
right.
do X,
or
Y, and
if
Z.
you do surgery and not chemo, you have a 40% chance of it recurring. Well, that means there's 60% chance that it won't. So like I had to start weighing all these things that people were throwing at me.
Right.
And you feel honestly, they're kind about it. I mean, they often say the same thing on both sides of the spectrum. You have people that will say, only you know what you're at peace with, and you've got to go with what you're at peace with. So both the conventional medicine and the alternative medicine are talking in that same language because they know every human person is unique and unrepeatable, right? We would say it that way.
Right.
But the reality of your body, literally, you have different genetics than anybody else. You can have the same name of cancer, but you have a whole different body than nobody knows how your body will react to chemo or naturopathic stuff. People live and die on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So like you go into it going, I have no idea what is about to happen. I cannot predict if this is going to work or not. I just know that I have peace going this way and I don't have peace going that way.
So that very scary. Personal decision, you chose the how do you say the word? Naturopathic
route.
Direction.
Yeah.
And you're a year and a half out.
Yeah.
Do you remain at peace with those decisions?
Yes.
And this was fascinating to me. Was it 6 months ago you and Wendy and I were on a call together, FaceTiming, and you showed us how this was some salve or something that you were using on the tumor, and how the tumor had emerged from your body.
Yeah. It's a pretty controversial deal, I will say. Like anybody that hears us talking about this, if they looked it up on the internet, it'll be like screaming at you, this is a crock, it's going to burn a hole in your skin, blah. But I mean, I had talked to somebody that had used it herself and then went to the guy who sold that particular salve. So I knew that it was actually effective and not just some like thing out there that was being advertised as such. But it's fascinating. The stuff that I have put in my body and the stuff that comes out, I will say you can tell that you're detoxing. You can tell that you feel different. You can tell that your body is in like prime condition, even though you have cancer growing in there. And I mean, the thing that you have to remember is that cancer is in everybody's body. Abnormal cells are always in people's bodies, but your immune system is supposed to be able to kick them out.
Right.
When your body is too overwhelmed with too many other things, it can't kick it all out. So then these abnormal cells, they hit up against each other because they're abnormally shaped. And so then they start connecting and then they create a tumor. That's literally what's happening. So when you clean up your immune system, it's able to kick out the stuff that it's supposed to kick out. And ultimately right now, I cannot verify this because I haven't had a PET scan. The process I'm doing right now, if I did, it's radioactive sugar, so it could kick up the growth of what I'm trying to kick out. But I will do one at some point to make sure everything's out. But I want to just recognize that all of these pieces of the puzzle that I'm doing, like supplements and blah, I mean, some of them are meant to, carry cancer out. Some of them detox. Some of them do this, do that, the other thing. And it seems like a pain in the butt until you realize you have so many layers of things that your body has tolerated for so long. Because I've been told over and over by not just these folks, but in the past I had learned this, your body gets down to like 40% of functioning before it puts up a flag and says, I'm really struggling.
Wow.
Like there's inflammation that's visible on the outside, like swollenness. It's been doing that under the surface for a long time before it gets to the point where you can see it or feel pain or whatever. So it's really sobering to think about the layers of crap that our bodies tolerate before they're like, actually, this is too much. I can't do this anymore. And oh, by the way, there's this mass growing that I can't kick it out, because your body will either try and kick it out or it'll hide it. And so what we saw in the pictures, when you do the salve, it's basically drawing stuff out. Well, the piece of tumor that emerged, it's got like a covering on it that's a lighter color. Well, that's the coating or whatever you want to call it that your body puts over the cancer to try and keep it from spreading.
Wow.
It tries to hide it. And then when I did this process, you could see the outside, and then on the inside, it was all gray. That's what they say is the cancer itself. And it comes out sometimes in chunks, or it'll come out all in one. But I'm on round 2 right now, and a couple of more chunks have fallen out. But like, it's just this bizarre, when I first heard about it, I was like, this is weird. I am just going to ignore the fact that I just heard that. And then I felt drawn to it. I mean, this has been the entire process. There are so many, you could spend a lifetime reading about all the ways that people think you could fight cancer. And I was just so overwhelmed. I'm like, whatever. I found a guy that did specific tests on my body to find out what kind of food I should eat, what supplements I should take, what works with my body. Not just like, oh, some people go vegan. Some people eat all meat. Some people do this. I'm like, what the heck? How do you know? Is it your genetics? Is it the type of cancer? And honestly, it really is a combination of those things. And when you start to chip away at the layers, eventually you start realizing the connection between the spiritual and the physical.
Yeah,
you see it right away on some level.
I want to press into
but
that.
That's where...
Because this connection between the spiritual and the physical is where theology of the body shines such a beautiful light.
Yeah.
And there's a statement in John Paul's teaching where he says that the whole of modern science, and praise God for modern science and all that it has done and shown and revealed.
Yes.
But the premise is the separation of the body and the soul.
Yes.
And in the end, that can only take us so far.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this is a small example of that, but the doctor who knows everything about your body and can diagnose this, and that, but has a terrible bedside manner.
Yeah.
There's a
disconnect
here, right?
Yeah.
Thank God for all his knowledge.
Right.
And we've all benefited from that, right? I had a major ski accident some years ago and shattered my femur and severed it at the hip. And thank God for what the doctor was able to do to reconstruct it and put a rod in there and screw it all back together. Or I would have been maimed for life or maybe even died.
Right.
But my experience in the hospital for 5 days when I was recovering was very interesting because there was this one night nurse. His name was Chris, and he treated me like a person. And I was in such a vulnerable place, and I needed to be treated like a person.
Yeah.
And there were other people who had their shifts who would just come through, and I just felt like a number on their checklist. And I understand they're busy and they got all kinds of other people they have to tend to, but this rupture of the body from the person. And healthcare, we have in this category over here
Yeah.
that we've divorced from, oftentimes from the dignity of the
Yes.
person.
Yes.
And there is something that Western medicine has to learn here.
Yeah.
For all that it has accomplished, for all
Yeah.
that's good about it, there has been this rupture from
Yes.
of body and soul.
Yeah.
And we have to
Right.
find a path back. And again, we're not here at the Institute to endorse this or that approach here. Talk to your own doctor if you're facing cancer.
Right.
But what I like about what you're saying is there are alternatives to the traditional paths. And
Yeah.
for you, it's proven very successful so
Right.
far.
So far. I mean, it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I'm like, so far, so good. It seems to be going in the right direction. It doesn't seem like I have cancer running through my whole body. It's like, for sure, there's a concentration of it right here. But the thing that I would point out, especially with the initial sense of spiritual and physical coming together, was actually when it had to do with food. I was contemplating, because of cutting all these things out of my diet, right, so that I'm not feeding this tumor with sugar or whatever else causes inflammation, blah, 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 right? So the reality of, just once, just this one thing, it's not going to kill me quickly,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
That
yeah,
was kind of
yeah.
my joke with people.
Interesting,
It's not going to kill me quickly, you know?
Right.
And I started making the parallel to how we rationalize sin, you know?
Huh.
How, just this once, just a little white lie. Just this. Just
Right,
that.
right.
Maybe just once. Nobody's going to notice. Nobody's around to see me. Oh my goodness. The parallel is so real.
Wow.
Because when you talk about, or when I talked about the building up of layers, our bodies are dealing with 20, 30 years of putting things with junk in them into our
Right,
bodies, and our
right.
bodies trying to fight to get it all out, whether it be preservatives or, heavy metals. There's all sorts of stuff in our environment and blah, 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 but like the layers, they build up, and then our body's like, I can't function. Sin, you build it up.
Yep,
Pretty soon
yep.
you have a nasty mortal sin type of habit, or, maybe it's not a habit or maybe it's not a mortal sin because it's a habit, but there's nasty stuff that builds up over time that are a lot harder to get out of your system than if you had started way back at the beginning
Right.
and tried to clean house earlier on. And that was one of the first insights that I had, combining, the food thing is so incredible when it comes to what you feed your body, what you feed your soul,
Yeah.
what builds up, what starts to bog you down. I mean, the parallel is so
Yeah.
real.
Yeah.
And
The parallel culminates at the height of our union with God, which is a spiritual reality.
Mm-hmm.
How does it happen? Through eating. Through eating his body and blood.
Right.
And drinking his blood.
Right.
That's the height of communion
Right.
with God. And I'm thinking of the very words of the Mass. Let the Holy Spirit come upon these gifts, right? Bread and wine. The Holy Spirit comes upon these physical realities, and these physical realities that we take into our bodies.
Yeah.
We take in Christ's body into our body, and this is the height of spiritual union through the body. That's the integrity of the spiritual and the physical. It's the sacramental life.
Coursing through your veins for at least 20 minutes while he's being digested.
There it is. Christ in you, the hope of glory.
Wants to be closer than the air around you.
And that, what does that, think of this, what does that make our tongue? Right? Talk about theology of the body.
Receptivity in every single cell.
If the Eucharist is what what the Catholic Church claims it is, then your tongue and my tongue and your tongue is the throne of the living God. Your tongue, my tongue, is the meeting place of heaven and earth. Right there. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Jen, we've talked about a heck of a lot in our conversation here today. One final question for our viewers to hear from your heart.
Okay.
it's a biggie, and I don't know how you could summarize it, but how has the theology of the body of St. John Paul II changed your life or impacted your life? How would you put that in 2 sentences?
Oh my gosh, 2 sentences.
2 sentences. You're on the spot.
It changed my life. I mean,
How?
honestly.
How? What did it do?
How do you summarize that?
Or let me put it this way.
I mean, it gave me the words to describe why we believe what we believe. And my excitement about that led to me then figuring out, okay, this is how I described it to my own brain. Now I can bring it to other people and help them understand. So, I mean, literally it changed the trajectory of my life because it's what I do for a living. But that doesn't sound very profound, but it's honestly the gift that was given to me, then now I turn around and give it to others. How's that?
There you have it. Straight from Jen Messing, founder and executive director of Into the Deep. Check out her work in the links in the description. And check out the links in the description about learning more about the Theology of the Body Institute, the courses we offer. I'm going to point you to another video I did right here in this studio with my father. You had dinner with my parents last night. You got to know them when you lived here in Pennsylvania. And my dad hiked the Appalachian Trail from start to finish at the age of 75. And just about 6 weeks ago, he and I had a long conversation at this table, which is, I was reminded of so many times when you and I were talking, Jen, about how creation leads us to the Creator. So check out that video and check out the courses we offer online and in person if you want to learn more about John Paul II's Theology of the Body. Jen, it's been a great blessing to have this conversation with you, to share my friendship with you, with our viewers. And please, let's keep Jen in our prayers as she continues to fight this fight of cancer.
Thank you.
Bless you, dear sister.
Appreciate that.